It's an imaginary line, a line of their own making in Washington and Berlin. Um, what we saw just recently, after all the bluster about nuclear weapons, which Putin trots out regularly, Ukraine actually invaded and took part of Russian territory, and Russia has said almost nothing. It's a device that Putin uses in order to dissuade the West from providing Ukraine the support that it needs, and that has largely worked. And we have been saying no, we've been denying types of systems, we've been denying their use all along in this over 2.5 year conflict. And that has worked very well for President Putin.
Will America grant permission to Ukraine to launch Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory? The Times says Britain thinks America's going that way, and the diplomacy is all lining up for a big announcement. There's a joint visit by David Lammy and Antony Blinken to Kyiv, followed by a trip to Washington for the Prime Minister Keir Starmer. If anyone knows, it'd be Kurt Volker, former United States Special Representative for Ukraine Negotiations. Kurt, good morning to you.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
Are we seeing really, people have said before that America have been very gradualist in their response to the Ukrainian situation. Do you think it's plausible we're about to see an announcement that Ukraine will be allowed, should be allowed, to fire these Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory?
Well, that does seem to be where things are headed, but the administration has not said so yet. They have still said at this point that they are still putting restrictions on. And the way Tony Blinken phrased it when he talked about his upcoming visit to Ukraine was that they are still negotiating. So there's obviously still some limitations they want to keep in place, even though they may be lifting some others. And to be clear, I don't think this makes any sense at all. I think Russia is flagrantly attacking Ukraine from any number of bases inside Russia that these missiles could hit and therefore push the Russians back. And we're still denying the Ukrainians the ability to do that so far.
Could they be entitled to use them to hit cities, to go after non-military bases? Is that acceptable?
No, of course that would be unacceptable. Russia does that, and it is a war crime, and there's absolutely no justification for either side to be deliberately targeting civilians or cities. But there are plenty of military installations that Russia has and uses in that zone within several hundred kilometers of the Ukrainian border. We're talking about fuel depots, we're talking about logistics hubs, we're talking about air bases with aircraft, we're talking about military training facilities. All of those are legitimate military targets.
Is the danger that America, throughout this, the US has tried to be a little bit pregnant, actually, on all of this? That we support Ukraine, but we won't let them use jets. We support Ukraine, but we won't let them use missiles. And presumably the fear is they think there's a calibrated response because if you go too far, Putin uses a nuke tactically, or he does something completely unacceptable that would ratchet up further. That's what they've been thinking, that there is a line and they don't want to cross it. Do you think that's actually sensible when you actually look at it, take a step back and look at that?
Yeah, I think it's an imaginary line, a line of their own making in Washington and Berlin. What we saw just recently, after all the bluster about nuclear weapons, which Putin trots out regularly, Ukraine actually invaded and took part of Russian territory, and Russia has said almost nothing. It's a device that Putin uses in order to dissuade the West from providing Ukraine the support that it needs, and that has largely worked. And we have been saying no, we've been denying types of systems, we've been denying their use all along in this over 2.5 year conflict, and that has worked very well for President Putin.
I guess the issue in some people's minds is if you're 99% sure that Putin wouldn't use a tactical nuclear weapon in response, that 1%, given the nature of if you get it wrong, is so significant that 1% you can't ignore.
You can't ignore it, but you have to calculate risk. One aspect here is take a look at Mariupol or take a look at Bakhmut and tell me what the difference is between having used a tactical nuclear weapon versus what Russia actually did.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to see. The Ukrainians are prepared to bear the risk of that. At the same time, the approbation that would accumulate on Russia for any use of nuclear weapons, not only from the West, but from countries all over the world, would be extraordinary. And then finally, we have warned the Russian military quite directly that any nuclear use would result in a direct conventional response. They don't want that, and I think they are desperately trying to avoid it. Moreover, Putin doesn't want to give an order that the military doesn't follow.
Yeah.
So I think that the risks are there, but we have to manage these risks, and we have to be prepared to make sure that we are not setting Ukraine up just for a slow death by denying them the systems that they need.
And just finally, Kurt, we've been talking a lot about the debates, the presidential debate. Is the clock ticking, do you think, when it comes for Ukraine and for US support of Ukraine? From everything you hear of Donald Trump, he may not win the election, but it's very, very close, so he may win the election. Is the Donald Trump administration, does that just put an end to all of this? Do you think that's a big date in everyone's mind, that the potential of that?
You know, you hear that a lot, but I don't see much evidence of that. Donald Trump was the one who lifted the arms embargo on Ukraine during his first term as president in 2017, providing them the first anti-tank systems. He always talks about the idea of negotiating from a position of strength and accusing the Biden administration of being in a weak position today. Moreover, if you look at the Congress, we're going to have very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine again, maybe even easier to manage if you have a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled House. You won't have the vice grip on the leadership in the House that we had last winter. So I think that this may actually tee up for sustained U.S. support, which is one of the critical things I think Putin needs to see in order for him to decide that maybe it's time to stop attacking.
Really interesting. Always great to speak to you, Kurt. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
That's Kurt Volker, the former United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, really making the point that we've crossed the line several times with Putin with what the US and the UK have provided, and this makes little difference if we provide a little bit more, except to Ukraine.